everyone, we'll finish up our second video, talk about the fallacies of unacceptability. Unlike the previous two groups of fallacies that we've looked at, the fallacies of unacceptability are fundamentally about how credible the premises actually are, or how likely they are to be true. It's not really going to be so much the way in which the premises relate to the conclusion, it's going to be an issue with the way the premises themselves are structured. Alright, let's begin! So if you think back to our video last week, where we were going through what we mean by the idea of evidentiary worth, we said that evidentiary worth has two basic conditions. First condition, if the premises are true, how much support do they actually supply to the conclusion? Both of our previous groups of fallacies, the fallacies of illusory support and the fallacies of minimal support, pertain to that condition. And both of them were to suggest that the premises, even if they're true, they don't do much work to actually support the conclusion. What we're going to talk about today addresses the second condition for evidentiary worth. Are the premises true, or if not, we don't know if they're true or not, how credible are they? How likely do we think they are to be true? So the fallacies of unacceptability are going to be instances where we have good reason to think that the premises lack credibility in some sense, and yet the way that the argument is structured might in some context sort of trick us into not recognizing this lack of credibility of the premises. So our first fallacy of unacceptability is what we're going to call the problematic premise fallacy. This one, sometimes students have a little bit of trouble with, so pay close attention here. We're talking about the premises, not a problem with the conclusion. That's important to note. Alright, so what is this fallacy first before we start getting into sort of its details and complexities? So the problematic premise fallacy takes place whenever an argument features premises that are less credible than the conclusion that they're supposed to be establishing, or at least less credible to some specific audience that the argument is addressed to. The last condition, we're going to call that acceptability. Your argument is sort of acceptable to some specific group. Here's another maybe simpler way of putting that point. If the premises are more controversial, or at least as controversial, as the conclusion that they're supposed to establish, something's gone wrong. The whole point of an argument is that premises give you reasons to believe a conclusion. Those premises, therefore, we said this way back when we were introducing arguments, premises should be less controversial than the conclusion that they're supposed to establish. They don't necessarily have to be certain, not necessarily everyone needs to agree with them, but they should be more readily agreed with, easier to accept than the conclusion that's trying to be established. So let's look at a specific example. So suppose that I'm addressing an argument to the NRA, which is a gun rights advocacy group in the United States. Right? My argument goes like this. So everyone knows that guns are highly dangerous tools, and that they can't be safely wielded by civilians. Thus, gun laws should be strengthened. Right. So the second premise of this argument is at the very least going to be unacceptable to the audience that I'm talking to. The NRA, at the very least, is not going to agree with me that it's not possible for guns to be safely wielded by civilians. Put that differently, that premise is just as controversial, if probably not even more controversial, than saying that there should be gun laws or gun laws should be strengthened further. So if the goal of this argument is to get the NRA or members of the NRA in the audience to change their mind, this argument's just not going to do it. The premises are not going to be things that they accept. Now, note, you might think here is the problem with the conclusion. That's not it. Of course, trying to argue that gun laws should be strengthened to the NRA is going to be a challenge, or to NRA members, that's going to be a challenge. Obviously, they're going to sort of be naturally reticent to accept that conclusion from the start. But that's often going to be the case, right? I mean, you usually make arguments with people who don't already agree with your conclusion. The problem here is not that they're going to be reluctant to accept the conclusion. The problem is really that I've given them no reason to accept that the conclusion is true. So the conclusion, something that to start with they're not persuaded of, I give them as reasons to believe that other things, like that second premise, that they're not likely to find persuasive or acceptable either. No progress has been made. Right? Not because the conclusion's unacceptable, but because the reasons that I've given aren't actually reasons that they're going to find at all persuasive, that aren't going to move us closer to the conclusion. Right? They're more controversial, the premises need to be less controversial than the conclusion that they're supposed to establish. Our next fallacy of unacceptability is what's called the begging the question fallacy. You also hear this sometimes called circular arguments. So this is an argument where the premises basically just restate the conclusion in some sense, more or less explicitly. I mean, maybe they change some words around, but sometimes it's almost be word for word, premise exactly the same as the conclusion. The problem here is that, since again the conclusion is supposed to be in some sense controversial, uncertain, the thing that needs to be supported, just restating it as a premise doesn't actually give us any sort of reason to believe that the conclusion is true. This is almost a subset of the problematic premise fallacy. Since the premise itself is just the conclusion, and people don't already accept the conclusion, the premise is also not acceptable. We've made no logical progress. It looks like maybe I've given reason to believe that the conclusion is true, but I really haven't. I've just restated the conclusion. So here would be an example of an argument that commits this fallacy. Illegally downloading movies is obviously immoral. Why? Well, because it's just wrong. To say that something is immoral and to say that something is just wrong is just the same thing, right? Those two expressions mean the exact same thing. The premise doesn't say anything different than what the conclusion says. Here's a fun note about circular arguments. If you think back to deductive logic, all circular arguments are actually valid propositional arguments. Because what does the argument basically boil down to? Basically, it boils down to premise, P, conclusion, P. Well, okay, for validity, we assume the premises are true. If P is true, is the conclusion true? Well, yeah, because it's the same thing. So actually, all circular arguments, or all arguments that beg the question, they're technically formally valid, but they're pretty useless. They're not going to establish anything new, and indeed, they don't get us anywhere toward discovering if the conclusion is actually true or not. All right, our last fallacy for this week is going to be what's called the false dilemma fallacy. This is where a premise in an argument makes it sound as if there's only two choices, an either or, when in fact there are many more than just those two. And indeed, it doesn't have to really be two. It's just that the premise ignores possibilities, right? So maybe the premise says that there's 5 possibilities when there's really 7. That would also be the false dilemma fallacy. Here's an example. If you see this in action, it should be pretty straightforward what I mean here. You should never go to any parties. Either you stay home and study all the time, or you will fail out of school. Okay, well, what's the problem with this argument? Pretty straightforwardly, there's something missing, right? There's an option between only studying and only partying that that premise is ignoring. And so since it ignores that possibility, say the possibility of studying hard, but then occasionally going out to party, right? The premise just seemingly maybe is compelling, but it actually on reflection isn't. It ignores sort of obvious other possibilities, and so therefore again lacks kind of credibility, even if sort of the stark way that the either or is sort of phrased might ignore that fact, and you might not notice that fact. Alright, so those are the fallacies of unacceptability that we're going to talk about this semester. Between the 3 groups of fallacies that we've discussed so far in Chapter 4, those are all of our going to be our sort of generalized probative inductive fallacies. What we'll start doing going forward is looking at sort of specific kinds of inductive probative arguments, say arguments from analogy, causal arguments, appeals to authority. We'll discover some more fallacies, but those fallacies will be specific to those individual argument types. All the ones we've talked about so far are relatively general. You can see them in a wide variety of contexts. All right, so that'll do it for this week. Hope you all are doing well. There is an exam going to be on Chapter 4 due this week as well, so make sure you study up and get ready for that. All right, bye.